Hello and welcome. You're watching News9. I'm Shweta Kothari. We're bringing you stories from the world of business, policy and economy. First up, Germany has slipped into recession as consumer spending narrows. Output in Europe's largest economy dropped 0.3% in the first 3 months of the year, following a 0.5% contraction at the end of 2022. Also, investors from 21 nations have now been exempted from angel tax. US, UK, France are on the list, but there is no exemption for Singapore, Netherlands or Mauritius, all major sources of FDI into India. We're also tracking aviation sector, where aviation regulator DGCA has asked Go First to submit a revival plan within 30 days. The airline had told DGCA that it would not be coming up with a strategy to restart and will not be committing to a timeline until the moratorium period ends. And banks will be notifying Income Tax Department about large cash deposits of 2000 currency notes above a threshold, and that essentially means that there will be IT lens on those who are depositing 2000 rupee note very, very frequently. All that and more on this bulletin. Joining me at this point in time in the studio is my colleague Karthik Malhotra. Also joining us is Rakesh Khar. I will come to you first, Karthik. Friday, finally. Good for us, but not so much for Germany. Germany is waking up to a rude shock. It is now the largest economy in Europe and in recession.
Absolutely, Shweta. And Germany was still very confident till even about a month ago, saying that it will tide over this difficult patch. Now, remember, when the Russia-Ukraine war had started, inflation was the biggest worry for all economies across the world. But Germany somehow had insulated itself because its dependence on energy from the Russia-Ukraine region was always low. And it being an aging population and a small country, energy bills, import bills were never very high for Germany. Yet, what perhaps it did not factor in was the inflation that comes on account of global supply chains. And Germany saw a 7.2% inflation, and that led to contraction in 2 consecutive quarters, 0.5%, 0.3%, and 2 consecutive quarters of downward growth, negative growth is pretty much the definition of recession. And here it is. Now, the finance minister of Germany is quite optimistic, and in fact, he's come on record to state that there is going to be a possibility of them turning the corner. And what he's really betting on and trying to encourage industry through his statement is that we've got to get our competitive spirit back. We've got to get our mojo back. Germany has been a country which has been known for its auto sector. The likes of Mercedes, BMW, Audi, Volvo, Volkswagen. It's pretty much, the hub of any revolution that has ever happened in the world of automobiles. From pretty much the world's first people-centric car, the Volkswagen Beetle, to the epitome of luxury across the other brands that I named. And it has always been an export hub for luxury cars and even spares, engines, etc. for the smaller cars. And yet it finds itself in a state where actually auto sales had dropped by about a third in the financial year that just went by. So difficult time for Germany, but what is the cascading effect that we should look at? People were assuming US is going to be next, but US surprised us yesterday. There's been a growth, very slight, 1.3% quarterly growth, but a growth nonetheless.
But a growth, yes.
Would UK be the next one to fall off the block? And how long is US also going to be able to sustain its growth, given the overall scenario around Fitch not being very comfortable with this prolonging debt ceiling talk between the Democrats and the Republicans? And now apparently the deficit between their negotiation between the Democrats and the Republicans is about $70 billion, right? So $70 billion in cost cutting or $70 billion in increasing the debt ceiling. Either way, the deficit margin right now is just about $70 billion. But X date is what, just about 4 working days, 5 working days away.
Absolutely.
So if Fitch were to cut US's everlasting AAA ratings and go negative on US, it becomes a problem for the treasury bonds, and it becomes a problem for the safe haven that US has always been, and for dollar as a currency and the markets as a whole. So this entire sentiment in the West is not looking too good at the moment.
Not looking very good. Rakesh is joining us at this point in time. Rakesh, German recession could have cascading impact not just on European economies, and as we discussed, UK could be next in line, but what's happening in US is also not very promising right now, with talks around debt ceiling, not progressing the way Joe Biden would like them to.
Yeah, morning, Shweta. I'm on the run, so pardon my being in a green cover. I think this was expected. The IMF in its January outlook did mention that we are heading for a recessionary framework. It's taken 6 months to reach us there, but overall bad news for India on many counts. Let's remember that our neighborhood is also in a fiscal ICU, especially Pakistan, and if the European market and also what we're hearing now that Germany has already announced recession. This is bad news on many fronts, and specifically US, I think has done better than what was expected. I think I don't have the latest numbers, but from what Karthik was mentioning, they're actually defying the projections that have come about. But yes, once the ratings from independent agencies come about and they downgrade the growth parameters, it's compounding the bad news. UK is a little worrisome. You may remember a couple of months ago, UK was under the radar, but they have made some sort of recovery. But overall, the bad news and recession in developed economies puts that additional pressure on developing back. And when it comes to India, our export scenario would further get slighted. And we have seen the numbers are falling. And so, in that sense, at one level, you can take some respite and say that, look, in India, there are no cars available to be, to be bought for a variety of reasons, demand and also, chip prices. And in Germany, car sales have plummeted, retail sales of FMCG products have plummeted. So we are in a relatively happier situation, but we live in a very, very interconnected world. 10 years ago, when we talked about Indian economy, we would still say that we are a little distant. Now that the entire distance is merged, so to say. We live in an interconnected world. We have dependencies, and the entire US, as per the Ukraine-Russian crisis, is impacting us adversely in more ways than one.
All right. Now, before we move further on our bulletin, I want to quickly also touch upon US debt ceiling, because we've been discussing that. As you rightly pointed out, X day is just around the corner. 1st of June is the deciding date, and there is still a deadlock of sorts. What will it mean for, not just US economy, stock market, but also developing economy like ours?
So, Shweta, anybody you speak to is fairly confident, if not overconfident, that a breakthrough will be arrived at. It's not going to be stalemate forever, and before the X date of 1st of June, there is going to be some sort of a reconciliation, either in spending cuts by the ruling Democrats, or which is being asked for by the Republicans, or some sort of a negotiation in upping the ceiling. Now, remember, US Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen had also stated a few days ago that it's an old practice which needs to be done away with, of having a debt ceiling, right? You don't really put a benchmark or a numeric value to, I will borrow only this much and no more. So, what India does is a debt to GDP ratio.
Practice economically, you borrow as much as you feel like, you keep printing money. I mean,
it has to be a function of your economy.
Right. And at the moment, the debt to GDP ratio for US is 130%, which essentially means there's a lot more debt on the table as opposed to GDP output.
But, even India has gone up to 120, 125% of its GDP not too long ago, even 18 months, 20 months ago, we had arrived at a stage that we were well above 100% debt to GDP ratio, which is all right. You're over leveraged, but you also have projects in the pipeline which are going to deliver.
Okay.
So, so as long as there is economic activity on, as long as your engines of the economy in the manufacturing or services space, whichever is your forte, continue to thrive, and there is a robust order book in the private sector, or assured spending on infrastructure, etc., by the government, which is going to yield direct or indirect impact on the economy, you could over leverage yourself. Like the example I had given the other day also. You may want to buy a house that costs you 1 crore rupees, but you may have only 10 lakh rupees in your pocket. You would be over leveraged in that sense. Your debt to GDP ratio would be 900%, 5%, right?
is correct.
You would be over leveraged, but then do you see income coming your way regularly for the foreseeable future? If yes, you could go ahead and over leverage yourself. So US has no reason to actually worry about investments or order books not flowing into the country, because it has always delivered. And whether you look at Silicon Valley, whether you look at any other sector that US is part of, the retail is a thriving sector. Of course, inflation is going to play a dampener for some time, but that's not going to last forever. And we see these economic cycles go up and down. And yeah, the downward trend is present right now, but yet there is slight growth, 1.3% that we mentioned. So I don't think there's anything for anybody to really worry if we were to believe trends and experts who have seen these cycles earlier. A breakthrough will be met, an agreement, negotiated agreement will be arrived at, and hence, there should not be a negative turn in the US. But does that mean US will still not go into recession? I wouldn't bet very heavily on that yet.
Absolutely, but so far the indications are not looking too bad. It is a growth, albeit of 1.3%. Germany is not looking at a very bright morning. It's 7 o'clock in Germany at the moment.
But even in the
Germans
US,
are going to wake up.
Yeah, so in the US also, you're right now very close to a stagflation. In fact, you are in stagflation, where your rate of growth is much lower than the rate of inflation. So the next logical step when you are in stagflation is recession. So, the trend lines are pretty clear that it is getting there. How slowly will it arrive at that final destination is something that we'll have to wait and watch for.
All right, but Germany, they're waking up to a rude shock of recession where growth contracted by 0.3% and not looking at very bright future given high energy prices, which have essentially narrowed consumer spending, leading to an overall decline in GDP output. We will, of course, keep tracking that story. But moving on to another important story coming in from India at this point in time, where investors from 21 nations have been exempted from angel tax. And the list includes US, UK, France. What it does not include, and surprisingly so, is Singapore, Netherlands, and Mauritius. And many, startup founders in India are sort of jittery. They're angry. They're also demanding that IT department relook at this proposal, Rakesh.
Yeah, right, Shweta. I think, the origin of this particular decision, which came about officially yesterday, lies in the budget announcement. So now we have the details on which countries are exempt, which countries are not exempt. It's very surprising, but there has some logic possibly that countries like Mauritius, not necessarily Singapore, Middle East, and Cayman Islands out of it, because Mauritius investments have been undercover for almost 2 decades now, and there have been challenges there. But it's also a fact that today it comprises about 25%, if I have the number right, of FDI flows coming in through those areas. So in that sense, there is need for an explanation from the government. But 21 countries exempt should also perk up. But these countries would seek an explanation since the majority of investments are flown through these areas. But overall, a good step forward if they are able to expand the ambit. And you're right, the startup ecosystem is going to raise a shindy against it, saying that why should there be a black area or a shadow area? And why not allow this to free fall? Because this is something that's going to really perk up the entire startup ecosystem, which is already struggling, so to say, because the winter of funding is increasing. So that sector needs a boost up, and it was promised in the budget. It has happened, but someone has to explain rightly why exactly is this large piece being kept out.
Okay. Karthik, 50% of FDI into India comes from Singapore, Mauritius, and UAE. All those 3 countries are not a part of the list. So what exactly is the rationale of coming up with a list that does not constitute majority of the money coming into India? And explain to us, for a layman, what angel tax means and how it impacts a startup founder in India.
Okay, so angel tax was introduced primarily to tax investments which are being made, private investments being made into a startup over and above the market capitalization of the startup. So anytime if the valuation of a startup is, let's say, $100 million, and if it raises the next round at $200 million, which is over and above the fair market value of the startup, then that delta comes under the ambit of angel tax. right? Now, what this does, this technically a startup is not filing tax on its profits because they end up making more losses than profits more often than not. So, angel tax was introduced that this is money flowing into the Indian ecosystem. It is coming into the shores of India. It is being invested in a company, which in that sense becomes a revenue, so to speak, for the company, though this is not a P&L function, it's a balance sheet function because it is investment, but this is physical money coming into a company, and hence it came into the ambit of the angel tax, right? And tax up to 25% is something that startups have been asked to pay. 25% of the overall investment that came into their startups and the delta over the fair market value of the startup versus the investment that they have drawn. Now, you mentioned Singapore and Mauritius, these are 50%, but add to that UAE and Netherlands, these 4 countries together are among the top 5 investors in the Indian startup ecosystem. Now, why is the government really doing this? And Singapore is also a fairly well regulated banking market, right? So, Singapore featuring in this list along with, let's say, a UAE, which is also a fairly tightly regulated economy, and Mauritius, which is in the gray area. Countries like Cyprus, etc., are of course completely in the gray area. But I think what I read from this list of 21 exempted countries, including UK, US, Australia, France, Italy, Germany, almost pretty much the entire Europe bloc, Korea, South Korea, these are more regulated markets where I think the Indian government has better trust equation with counterparts, and they feel that entry of any sort of black money, loose money coming into the Indian economy will be withheld right at those countries itself, right? Now, in addition to countries which are making, these 21 countries which will make investments in India, which may not be subjected to, or those startups may not be subjected to angel tax, what is interesting also to note is that the startup, to avail of any exemption on angel tax, should also be a registered with DPIIT startup.
Right.
So, if you are a startup registered with DPIIT, only then can any investment coming from these 21 countries also be exempt. That is number one. And number two, fairly interesting there also is that this exemption will be valid only till a threshold of 25 crore rupees as paid up capital.
Right.
And apparently not beyond that.
Okay.
Right. The third thing which
so beyond which angel tax will
it'll kick in, right? The third thing which is right now a gray area is that this is what the notification clearly states, is that we are talking about angel tax as long as there is a direct investment happening in a startup.
Okay.
Now, if any one of the non-exempt countries were to come and invest in India by creating special purpose vehicles, then there is no angel tax liability, right? So this is gray area. I'm not saying for certain that this will happen, but this seems to be one way around it, that even countries like Singapore, UAE, Mauritius, Cyprus, etc., can continue to invest in Indian startups and can form a special purpose vehicle within the country through their investments, using a merchant banker and making investments in these DPIIT registered companies, startups, to avoid the angel tax on them.
Okay, and these are the non-exempted countries.
That's right.
If they want to avail exemption of any sort,
that's right.
That's
so
the way
that's
around
a gray area.
it.
That an SPV may be a gray area, and then of course there are pension funds and there are category 1 funds, etc., which will not, hedge funds for example, which may not be subjected to angel tax.
Okay. Before we move further, Rakesh, you mentioned that this is contentious. The provisions of angel tax were of course brought in the budget of 2023, but it has been widely talked about since then, because startup community, they're calling it regressive, saying that it only harms us because we are early age startups, we are early startups, we are in our very initial stage of getting funding, and it really hampers and dents our ability to raise money.
First of all, I think startups have a point, but so has the regulatory framework. See, globally what's happening is that there are all kinds of companies and there are all kinds of investments going through such routes. Not necessarily from each and every country, but these island countries and Mauritius in particular. The irony of Mauritius is it's a destination which is globally a heaven for tax haven, and not necessarily all funds flowing in from this region, not just to India, but many other countries are not clean. So in that sense, Mauritius should have been a clear question mark. But my own sense, Shweta, is that there is some sense of gradualism in this notification. I do see Singapore, as Karthik rightly mentioned, is one of the most regulated and clean financial markets in the world. So is UAE. So I do believe that in the second tranche, while we hear from the government and the finance ministry on the details why they've been kept out for now, I do believe that there would be a second set of countries that will come in. But Cayman Islands, for instance, and also Mauritius may finally be out of this entire domain. What is also important is that startups do need this facility, and it has come about in the budget. So in that sense, they should welcome it, but without any inclusions and exclusions as caveat. Your point about startups needing that support from the government, I think government is also cognizant and conscious of leveraging the startup story, so to say, unleashing the animal instinct in the entrepreneur story in India, whereas the big capital is still not firing. So in that sense, I would imagine that Government of India would stay focused on bringing some relief to the startup ecosystem. And we must also remember that the financial transactions, whether at FATF is the international body which looks at illegality of financial transaction when it comes to non-financial reasons used, such as terrorism and other areas. It's an agenda for global bodies to look at, and India has been pushing for Pakistan to be put on the FATF list because of terror funding. So it's not a very black and white situation when it comes to looking at investments in these countries. But yes, another interesting point here is that how can you ban sovereign funds and pension funds, which are relatively clean and have invested globally in not just startup ecosystem but also in mega corporations. In India, for instance, in the healthcare sector, many these kind of funds are invested deeply in big brick and mortar companies. For instance, I do remember Max invested in I think Apollo also has some such kind of funds. So there is need for an explanation from CBDT to tell us how exactly has this list been framed and whether, as I expect, a second list is coming.
Okay, interesting. We'll have to wait and
So
watch out for
Rakesh,
the second
actually,
list.
just clarification here, sovereign funds, pension funds, category 1 FPIs are part of the exemption list. So these continue to be exempt.
No, I was saying from Singapore and other countries.
Oh, okay, right, got it.
Right, okay.
The pension fund, a sovereign fund, is underwritten by the government. So what is the challenge there?
Yeah, so I think even from the non-21 exempt countries, these funds continue to be exempt from angel tax, is what my reading of the CBDT statement is.
I read that even they are excluded.
Okay.
Okay.
Maybe I read it wrong.
I think more chances I read it wrong.
All right, we will bring more clarity on that story. We're going to shift focus for now. Aviation regulator DGCA has asked Go First to submit a revival plan within 30 days, asking airline whether it can fly or not. They're basically looking at Go First's preparedness to go back into skies. A story that we've been discussing here very, very widely, Karthik, and that is whether Go First is coming back anytime soon or not. We had Mark Martin on the panel yesterday, and he said a realistic deadline should be 15th or 16th of June, not the end of this month, which is just around the corner, 4-5 days from now. But a 15th or 16th of June looks realistic for Go First to come up with a strategy to revive itself, gives enough time for DGCA to go on ground to check its preparedness, and maybe that's when we're going to see Go First resuming operations.
So one thing is for certain, we will know 30 days from now, 25th, 26th of June, we will know for sure. That is the outline given by DGCA, right, whether Go Air is going to hit the skies anytime soon or not. But the question is, how will it? It still has 50% of its aircraft with faulty engines.
Right.
There has been no breakthrough with Pratt & Whitney. There is why did Go Air, file for voluntary insolvency in the first place? Because it was feeling a financial crunch. It was feeling the heat of a pressure on its own books, due to which it felt best to ground itself voluntarily, right? So if it were to resume operations again, the financial crunch doesn't go. It's not that we've seen any fresh infusion of capital.
No money has come in, absolutely.
Right. There has in fact been a revenue loss since 3rd of May, since the airline was grounded. So it's been a month of revenue loss. Forget profitability for now, but definitely revenue loss. So cash flows have completely dried up for 1 month. There was an existing financial crunch. The faulty engines continue to be faulty. 50% of the fleet continues to be grounded, even if it were to resume operations tomorrow. Right. Can it fly with the balance 50% of the fleet and yet make money? Would that be the endeavor of Go First? It seems fairly unlikely, because if that was the case, it could have just cut down on its routes, taken Pratt and Whitney to the courts rather than filing for its own insolvency, and flown with the 50% serviceable aircrafts and not really self-grounded itself.
Absolutely. What's the road ahead looking like, Rakesh, for Go First at the moment? As Karthik rightly pointed, there is no money that's coming. In fact, the existing sources of revenue have also dried up since it grounded its operations. Are you hoping that the government will step in form of a credit line, will help Go First, sort of prop up its operations at least temporarily before it can come back on its feet?
First of all, I think the DGCA, timeline, one can debate whether it's a realistic timeline or not. What is certain is the DGCA wants to keep many more airlines on the ground. I mean, in that sense, that intention is welcome. But is it a realistic timeline? It's not. Karthik rightly mentioned they don't have the feet on the ground. They might have some of the planes on the ground, but they're incapacitated because they're probably with bad engines or no engines, flying. So in that sense, this timeline to my mind will be extended. I think it's just to showcase an intent that we want Korea to be flying anytime soon. And also to specifically your question whether the government will step in. I think it might nudge the promoter company of Korea to make some investment, and maybe Government of India does open a line of credit. But the problem with that is that at one level the government said that we have no business to be in business, especially which are like so-called luxury businesses, as airline is seen in it's a core infrastructure business. So it will be facing a lot of backlash from the society and the opposition party in political domain if it does open a line of credit independent of other airlines. It has just invested and bled, for so long for Air India, and then finally sold it off. Tata's having the muscle to buy. So in the short term, good news that government wants, the regulator wants Go First to fly, but it needs to be armed with the right wherewithal to do so. Government must actually DGCA must, not government directly nudge. I mean, I haven't seen a high level meeting with Pratt and Whitney. Not just about Go here. They need to get them on the drawing board and tell them what's happening, because there is a global order book for Pratt and Whitney, and they're struggling with managing it. But there is obviously some discretion there. So that discretion has to be, so to say, viewed and monitored by some agency in India, which is, I think, DGCA is the right thing. Because independent airlines like Indigo also and SpiceJet, everybody's wanting a piece of those engines. So who will decide who will get them first? And there are charges of commercial violations when it comes to Go First and traction between in terms of payments not being made. But since there is a strong intent and an express intent to keep the airline flying, it's time to do some hard negotiations on the table. And as regards the line of credit, I've been surprised all this while that Go First is not a standalone airline company. It is backed by promoters who have other businesses. If they really want to keep it alive, as a for the interim, they'll have to really come up in the front and say that we want to keep it flying. We'll do something exceptional, even if it means tweaking our other businesses and those P&Ls to try and inject some life into Go.
Okay, so some life there needed, much needed for Go First in order to revive itself. We don't know when that's going to be, but a realistic timeline could be around end of June. We'll of course have to wait and watch out for that. But moving on to another important story that's coming in with regards to 2,000 rupee deposit. And Rakesh, we're given to understand that banks are now going to notify Income Tax Department in case there is a large cash deposit. Something we've been discussing here for a while, the need to withdraw 2,000 rupee note, and if people end up depositing 2,000 rupee note in large chunks, one should be able to identify, banks, IT departments should be able to identify who these depositors are, and we are given to understand at this point that banks will, and in fact private banks have already been asking people to fill a form before they deposit, and that form, in a sense, that information will be handed over or passed down to IT department now.
It's all expected. It is shrouded in, again, lots of confusion. I don't know why the way it's being conducted has happened. I mean, SBI is not asking for ID proof. If you don't have enough ID proof, how do you scrutinize and carry it back to the option of those who are investing in it?
But I'm told the lines, the queues at SBI are so huge and so long that people would rather prefer going back to private banks, in which case you have to fill a form.
Yeah, so but why this discrimination? I am told the RBI governor is meeting all bank chiefs again, I think tomorrow. This should be sort of, there has to be uniformity, as we've been saying repeatedly. And if the purpose is to catch even, 10%, 5%, whatever government estimation is of, bad money or unclean money morally, as Karthik that they pointed out, which it turned out later that it was actually soiled notes. So if that is the intention, then you have to go a little more concerted, little more considered in this case, and have far greater, ways and means to check it. And a pertinent question, like Shweta, you mentioned in an earlier debates when the decision came about, I want to look at the list that happened in the 2016 demonetization.
Me
Even then,
too. Me
yeah.
too, Rakesh. I want to
So
know who the holders were.
yeah, so I think there would be some list. How credible that list is, how cogent that list is, what is the trajectory of that list. So in that sense, lofty ideals, maybe well intentioned. I would say very well intentioned. But when it comes to the stick of enforcement, very tardy implementation ideas stick my neck out.
All right, very tardy implementation. We are hoping, of course, that banks, will collect the right sort of information, will pass it on to IT department, and that, of course, is the big news coming in, that banks will be passing that information to IT department, and that, in a sense, justifies why currency notes, 2000 currency note holders will be identified, how they'll be identified. Karthik, it's interesting to note, and this was a conversation I had with somebody in the office last evening when I was getting down the lift, and that is, there are actual queues now at this point in time. If you go to Sector 18, if you go to CP, people are now standing for hours, in fact, trying to exchange their currency. We haven't done a ground check just as yet, but I'm hoping we'll be able to send somebody and get a sense.
26th of May, when 23rd of May,
23rd
sorry,
of May.
when the exchange facility started, we in fact did send our colleague Amit Ranjan on ground, and there's practically nobody. He
Nobody that
counted
day.
3 people in the queue, right? And same case even at the jewelry store that he went to, he didn't see too many queues. So there are mixed reports, and I think I'm all for the IT department coming in and really taking a very hard look at who these depositors are and who these folks are which continue to hold the 2000 rupee notes. But in the absence of banks seeking any documents, in the absence of any very clearly mentioned guidelines that Rakesh also just pointed out in terms of how many times can you come in a day, stand in a queue, why is there no form being filled, slip being filled, PAN, Aadhaar, etc. being verified. How does the IT department really keep track of people who are coming multiple times with large wads of cash? I mean, I'm pretty sure just the little CCTV camera which is placed right on top of the teller is not going to do the job unless we've got
Not
facial
enough
recognition,
at
AI
all.
scanners, link it back to, let's say, the faceless, sorry, the paperless entry at airports, and figure out, oh, these are the same guys who are traveling, these are the same guys who are depositing chunks of
coming
money
back
in
3
the bank
times in a day.
and coming back 3 times a day. I think it's going to be very hard. Maybe it's been issued as a deterrent. It may have been issued as a deterrent that, hey, we have our eyes on you. Take it easy. If you have tons of cash, spend it in the economy. At least we'll get some some GST from that.
Absolutely.
As opposed to going
But
into the
what
bank
surprises
multiple
me,
times.
and what Rakesh pointed out, and that is, you can't have 2 different sort of regulations or notifications for 2 different banks.
Yeah.
You can't have an SBI not asking for any proof, then a private bank asking you to
Shaktikanta
fill
Das
up.
came on record very clearly saying that standard rules of depositing 50,000 rupees or more apply.
But
What-
even for exchange, Karthik, and that's what I'm alluding to. If I were to go and exchange in SBI, I'm told now that I don't have money, I haven't exchanged. But for people who have, they're saying you don't need to furnish any identity proof. But if I were to go to a private bank and exchange, I need to fill up a form.
Because private banks are playing it safe.
Right.
This is also something that we had discussed earlier. Tomorrow if there's an inquiry on a private bank, that how is it that you got so much money, and if there is a question, if there is somebody from the IT department or the Ministry of Finance or the RBI who comes to a bank and says, your bank got the highest number of pink notes, where did they come from? The banks will then not have an answer. So to prepare themselves for that eventuality of having an answer for the RBI officials, then they are getting people like you and me to fill in those slips and furnish some sort of a documentation proof.
Right. So some sort of documentation proof, of course, is necessary if you're trying to exchange your large currency, 2000 rupee currency notes in private banks. But as far as public sector bank and specifically SBI is concerned, you don't really need to furnish any sort of proof. And we're going to end this bulletin with news that in fact is coming in. Tina Turner, who's the pioneer rock and roll star, became a pop behemoth in the 1980s, has died at the age of 83 after suffering from long illness. We're leaving you with that song of hers. Song at this point we don't have the rights to play, but Tina Turner there, the music legend, has died at the age of 83.
The queen of
rock,
rock, simply the best. What's love got to do with it? Well, love has got everything to do with the music that she produced for us, and that music
she leaves
is going
behind
to live
a
on
rich
forever.
legacy, music that will live on forever. All right.
Tribute being paid to Tina Turner, and that's
those are
LP,
fans, of course.
LP of her album.
And those are fans, of course, paying tribute to Tina Turner at this point in time. Remember, she was 83 years old, suffering from long illness, has now passed away as of this morning.